Something extraordinary is happening right now between the United States and Iran, and most people are not grasping the full weight of what is unfolding. This is not just another round of diplomatic posturing. This is not just another deadline that comes and goes with no consequences. What is happening in February and March of 2026 is the most dangerous standoff between these two countries in modern history, and the outcome of this confrontation will reshape the entire Middle East, the global oil market, and the balance of power in ways that will affect every single person on this planet. So let us start from the very beginning and make sure you understand every piece of this puzzle, because the story is far more complicated, far more desperate, and far more consequential than the headlines are telling you. Let us go back to where the roots of this crisis were planted, because nothing that is happening today can be understood without understanding the choices that were made years ago. In 2015, the United States, along with the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. That deal was built around a very simple trade. Iran would accept strict limits on its nuclear program, allow intrusive inspections by international monitors, and pull back from the threshold of nuclear weapons capability. In exchange, crippling economic sanctions that had been strangling the Iranian economy for years would be lifted, and Iran would be allowed to reintegrate with the global financial system. For a country whose currency had been battered, whose oil exports had been slashed, and whose ordinary people were struggling to afford medicine and basic food, that deal was a lifeline. And for years, international inspectors certified again and again that Iran was complying. The deal was working. But then Donald Trump, in his first term, made a decision that experts across the political spectrum would later call one of the most consequential foreign policy mistakes in a generation. In May of 2018, he tore the United States out of that agreement. He called it the worst deal ever made. He promised that maximum pressure, meaning the most devastating sanctions imaginable, would force Iran back to the table and produce a far better agreement. What actually happened was the opposite. Iran, stripped of the economic benefits that had kept it inside the deal, gradually abandoned its own restrictions. It began enriching uranium to levels that had no civilian purpose. By 2024, Iran had stockpiled enough fissile material enriched to 60% purity, just one technical step away from weapons-grade levels, for multiple nuclear bombs. The very problem that the original deal had been designed to solve had been made dramatically, catastrophically worse. Now we are in 2026, and Donald Trump is back in the White House for his second term, facing the consequences of the crisis his first term created. And this time, there's a new layer of urgency, because in June of 2025, the United States, operating alongside Israel, launched a massive military operation targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That operation, which Trump calls Operation Midnight Hammer, used B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropping 30,000-pound bunker buster munitions against the deeply buried nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Trump declared the operation a complete success. He said Iran's nuclear weapons program had been obliterated. He put a page on the White House website literally titled, "Iran's nuclear facilities have been obliterated, and suggestions otherwise are fake news." But here is where reality begins to diverge sharply from the official narrative, and here is where the story becomes genuinely dangerous. Steve Witkoff, Trump's own special envoy to these negotiations, recently said that Iran is approximately 1 week away from having enough enriched uranium to assemble a nuclear bomb. 1 week. That statement is flatly incompatible with the idea that the nuclear program was obliterated. Satellite imagery from late January 2026 shows construction work at the damaged facilities in Natanz and Isfahan, with roofs being built over bombed-out rubble. Iran is rebuilding. And not just rebuilding, it is rebuilding smarter, deeper, and harder to destroy. Intelligence reports indicate Iran is attempting to move critical nuclear infrastructure deeper underground, in some cases below the depth that even the most powerful conventional weapons can reach. At the Parchin military complex, Iran has completed a concrete structure around a sensitive facility and is now covering it with soil, essentially burying it beyond the reach of future strikes. Iran's parliament approved a motion to close the Strait of Hormuz. The country's military commanders are saying publicly that their finger is on the trigger. This is the context in which Trump sent a personal letter to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in March of 2025, proposing direct negotiations and warning, in his own words, that there are two ways Iran can be handled, militarily or through a deal. Khamenei initially did not even acknowledge the letter. He called the invitation to negotiate a deception of public opinion. He said that speaking of an olive branch while simultaneously threatening military strikes and strangling the economy is not diplomacy. It is coercion wrapped in diplomatic language. But behind the scenes, something significant was happening. According to multiple reports, Khamenei's top advisors warned him in private that the combination of military threat and economic collapse could genuinely bring down the Islamic Republic. And so, by the end of March 2025, Iran sent a reply expressing a limited willingness to engage in nuclear talks. But the critical word there is limited, because Iran made clear from the very first round of talks that it would only discuss the nuclear file and that uranium enrichment, the central demand that the United States wanted Iran to abandon, was completely and permanently non-negotiable. Multiple rounds of negotiations followed, always mediated by Oman, always indirect, with the two sides never sitting in the same room. And round after round produced the same result. Expressions of serious discussion, claims of constructive atmosphere, and then a complete collapse over the same fundamental disagreement. The United States wants Iran to permanently dismantle every enrichment facility, destroy its centrifuge infrastructure at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, hand over or ship out its stockpile of enriched uranium, and end its support for regional proxy groups like the Houthis and Hezbollah. Iran says enrichment is a sovereign right enshrined in international law under Article 4 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that it will not allow its nuclear program to be destroyed simply because the United States demands it, and that its missile program and regional alliances are entirely separate matters that have no place in nuclear negotiations. These are not positions that are gradually edging toward each other. These are positions that are structurally incompatible, and yet both sides have continued to talk. Why? Because both sides are using the talks for something other than reaching an agreement. Experts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who have direct access to administration thinking, have said plainly that there is deep skepticism within the Trump administration that diplomacy will produce any acceptable outcome. Instead, the diplomatic process is being used to, in the words of policy analysts, sharpen the choices of Iranian leadership, and by time to ensure the appropriate military assets are in position throughout the region. Iran, for its part, is using the talks to delay the possibility of a U.S. attack, to buy time to harden and rebuild its nuclear infrastructure, and to avoid giving Trump a clear public justification for military action. Both sides are playing for time, and both sides are preparing for the possibility that time runs out. And now in February 2026, Trump has given Iran another ultimatum. He wants a deal within 10 to 15 days. The clock is ticking. And backing up that deadline is the most terrifying display of American military power assembled in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which arrived in the Arabian Sea on January 26, 2026, has been conducting round-the-clock flight operations. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's most advanced aircraft carrier, a vessel displacing over 100,000 tons and powered by two next-generation nuclear reactors, crossed through the Strait of Gibraltar on February 20th and is heading directly toward the region. Together, these two carrier strike groups give the United States 14 major warships in the theater, including 9 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles. More than 120 aircraft have been flown into the region over the past 2 weeks. F-22 Raptor fighters, which are specifically designed to suppress enemy air defenses and escort B-2 bombers through contested airspace, have been deployed. Those F-22s and B-2s are the exact combination that was used in Operation Midnight Hammer 9 months ago. The message is not subtle. The message is, we have done this before, and we are ready to do it again, but bigger. Iran has responded to this buildup with a combination of defiance, military signaling, and desperate diplomatic maneuvering. On February 16th, as nuclear talks were underway in Geneva, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began live-fire military exercises in the Strait of Hormuz and announced the temporary closure of sections of the waterway. Think about what that means. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. It is the single most strategically vital shipping corridor on Earth. Roughly 20% of all global oil production passes through that strait every single day. About 3,000 vessels transit it every month. If Iran closes that waterway, or even seriously threatens to close it, the consequences for the global economy are immediate and catastrophic. Oil prices would spike. Inflation, which is already elevated across most of the world, would accelerate dramatically. Supply chains for every major Asian economy, which are heavily dependent on Gulf energy, would be thrown into chaos. India gets nearly half of its crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Countries across Southeast Asia depend on it for the majority of their natural gas. This is not a bluff with no teeth. Iran has submarines. It has mines. It has swarms of fast attack boats equipped with anti-ship missiles. It has a parliament that already voted to close the strait. And, for the first time in history, it actually did close sections of it, even if only for a few hours, as a demonstration of will. Khamenei has been directly and repeatedly explicit about Iran's position on the nuclear question. He said publicly, with complete clarity, that enrichment is central to Iran's nuclear program, and that he rejects United States' demands to halt it. He said that if any real negotiations are to take place, they cannot be based on the foolish demand that Iran move to zero enrichment. He invoked religious symbolism, drawing on figures from Thawi's 750 years of Shia Islamic history to signal that Iran would not bend to what he characterized as corrupt foreign leadership. And critically, when reports surfaced that one of the scenarios being discussed in Washington involves a direct strike against Khamenei himself, and multiple sources have confirmed that a plan to kill Khamenei and his son Mojtaba was floated to Trump, the Iranian government did not collapse into submission. Instead, Iran's military immediately began preparing for the possibility of a decapitation strike. A new Defense Council secretary was appointed with the specific mandate of strengthening defense preparations and developing mechanisms to counter emerging threats. Military vehicles were moved into a stadium in Tehran to protect them from airstrikes. Iran's chief of staff, Abdolrahim Musavi, said Iran was fully prepared to deliver vengeful blows and warned that Iran had revised its military doctrine toward an offensive posture. IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour warned that his forces had their finger on the trigger. IRGC Naval Chief Alireza Tangsiri stood on the deck of a warship in the Strait of Hormuz and said that, if ordered, his forces are ready to make good on their threat to close the waterway entirely. The significance of all this cannot be overstated. What Iran is saying through every channel available, military exercises, public speeches, diplomatic communications sent to the United Nations Security Council, and statements from its foreign minister on American television, is that it does not believe any American leader, any American threat, any amount of military pressure, or any economic devastation will cause the Islamic Republic to abandon its nuclear program. And when analysts and officials in Tehran talk about this position, they frame it not as a negotiating stance, but as an existential commitment. The regime believes, and the evidence increasingly supports this belief, that its nuclear capability is the only thing standing between the Islamic Republic's survival and the kind of fate that befell Muammar Gaddafi when he voluntarily surrendered Libya's nuclear program and then found himself overthrown and killed. In late 2024, Khamenei's own advisor, Kamal Karazi, said explicitly that Iran would modify its nuclear doctrine and move toward weapons development if it faced an existential threat. In October 2025, multiple credible sources reported that Khamenei had quietly authorized the development of miniaturized nuclear warheads for ballistic missiles, a step that, if true, represents a fundamental crossing of lines that the regime had previously maintained. And a secret team of Iranian nuclear engineers, according to reporting from February 2025, had been working on an accelerated pathway to weapons production that could compress the timeline from years to months. This is what changes everything about the statement embedded in the title of this discussion. That even if Khamenei dies, Iran will not stop. What that captures is a reality that Washington has consistently failed to reckon with. The nuclear program in Iran is not a personal project of one aging supreme leader. It is not a policy that will be reversed when a new leader takes power. It has been institutionalized, militarized, buried literally underground, and woven into the fabric of Iranian strategic doctrine at every level. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, whose senior commanders were shaped by years of war in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and whose loyalty is fierce and unconditional, has its own deep institutional commitment to Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. The Council on Foreign Relations, analyzing the imminent leadership transition in Iran given Khamenei's age of 86 and the enormous pressures he is under, concluded that when Khamenei passes from the scene, through natural causes or otherwise, what likely follows is not a moderate reformist government willing to make nuclear concessions. What likely follows is military rule, with the IRGC holding the keys to the country's future and having even less appetite for nuclear compromise than the aging clerics who are currently in charge. Meanwhile, the Iranian population is experiencing a humanitarian catastrophe that has no modern precedent in the country's history. Let us talk about the economics, because this is where the other half of this story lives. Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said it plainly at the Economic Club of New York. The goal of America's maximum pressure sanctions campaign is to, quote, make Iran broke again. And in one narrow, brutal sense, it has worked. The Iranian rial, which traded at around 42,000 to $1 a decade ago, crossed the 1 million rial per dollar threshold in March of 2025. By December 2025, it had fallen to 1.75 million to $1. By early 2026, it hit 5 million on the open market on some days, making it effectively the least valuable currency on earth. Inflation hit 48, 6% in October 2025, and was running at 2% in December. Food price inflation reached 58% in September 2025. Bread and grain prices have nearly doubled. Fruit costs surged by 75%. The Social Security Organization of Iran announced in 2024 that 57% of Iranians are experiencing some level of malnourishment. The Parliament's own research center reported that 50% of Iranian males between the ages of 25 and 40 are unemployed and not looking for work. Estimates suggest that between 22 and 50% of Iranians are now living below the poverty line. In December 2025, Iran's economic crisis reached a breaking point. The Pezeshkian government, desperate and running out of options, eliminated the preferential exchange rate that had been subsidizing imports of essential goods like cooking oil, livestock feed, and fertilizer, replacing it with a monthly electronic coupon worth 10 million rials, a sum that, at the collapsed exchange rate, was worth almost nothing. The consequences were immediate and devastating. One of Iran's largest banks collapsed. There was a run on the banking system. The central bank had to print money. The currency went into free fall. On December 28, 2025, protests erupted, first among the shopkeepers and merchants of Tehran's Grand Bazaar, the very heart of Iranian commercial life, and spread within days to all 31 provinces of the country, including areas that had historically been considered strongholds of regime support. The IRGC moved to crush the protests with lethal force. Estimates of the death toll range from the government's official figure of around 3,000 to independent estimates as high as 36,500, making this one of the largest massacre events in modern Iranian history. The internet was shut down. International phone calls were blocked. Tens of thousands of people were detained. And yet the protests did not fully extinguish. They continued, erupting and re-erupting, fueled by an economy that has simply ceased to function for ordinary people. Besant, when he testified before the Senate Banking Committee, openly took credit for this outcome. He called it a swift and grand culmination of the maximum pressure campaign. He described how the sanctions had cut off Iran's access to the international financial system, prevented it from repatriating oil revenues even from the limited oil it could still sell, forced the central bank to print money, and triggered the inflation spiral that ultimately drove people into the streets. And he was correct that it worked in those narrow terms. The currency collapsed. The bank collapsed. People went into the streets. What he did not address, and what the administration has not adequately answered, is why the collapse of Iran's economy and the killing of thousands of protesters has produced exactly no nuclear concessions whatsoever, because it has not. Despite the fact that Iran's economy is experiencing its deepest and longest crisis in modern history, despite the fact that ordinary Iranians cannot afford eggs and are going without cancer treatment, the nuclear program continues. The nuclear facilities are being rebuilt. New ones are being buried deeper underground. New centrifuge manufacturing sites are being established. And the most senior officials in Tehran continue to say, with complete consistency, that enrichment is non-negotiable. The reason for this paradox lies in the nature of the Islamic Republic itself and the logic that has governed its survival since 1979. The regime has never derived its legitimacy from economic performance. It derives it from ideological commitment, revolutionary identity, and the narrative of resistance against American and Israeli aggression. Every time the United States tightens sanctions, every time a threat is issued, every time a carrier strike group appears in the Arabian Sea, it actually reinforces the regime's core narrative, that Iran is under siege by a hostile superpower, and that only by maintaining its strategic deterrence, its missiles, its nuclear capability, its regional proxies, can the Islamic Republic survive. Economic suffering, in this framework, is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of resistance. And the regime has, for 4 decades, been able to point to external enemies as the cause of domestic hardship, while suppressing any political movement that tried to direct that anger at the government itself. The talks in Geneva on February 26, 2026, the very day before the writing of this account, ended without a deal. Oman's foreign minister said there had been significant progress without elaborating. Iran's foreign minister Araghchi said the discussions were very intensive and that there were constructive proposals on both nuclear issues and sanctions relief. But just before the talks concluded, Iranian state television reported that Tehran was determined to continue uranium enrichment, rejected any proposals to transfer enriched uranium abroad, and was insisting on the lifting of all sanctions. Trump said the ball was now in Iran's court. He said he was waiting to hear the secret words, "We will never have a nuclear weapon." He had not heard those words. He gave Iran another 10 to 15 days. What happens in those 10 to 15 days will determine whether we are entering a period of managed tension or a period of open warfare. The military assets are in place for a strike campaign of historic scale. 2 carrier strike groups, more than 120 aircraft, B-2 bombers that can carry the same bunker buster weapons used at Fordo, F-22s to clear the path, Tomahawk missiles on 9 destroyers ready to launch. Iran's air defense has already been severely damaged by Israeli strikes in 2024 and the U.S. strikes in June 2025, leaving it poorly equipped to counter a major coordinated assault. Its air force has also been badly degraded. But Iran retains genuine retaliatory capability that should give any serious strategist pause. Its navy, including 3 Russian Kilo-class diesel submarines, is largely intact. Its inventory of fast attack boats, mines, and anti-ship missiles in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz could cause enormous damage to U.S. naval assets, and, more critically, to global energy flows. Its proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, the remaining elements of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and affiliated groups in Iraq and Syria represent a network of retaliatory capacity that spans the entire region. And China and Russia, whose navies just conducted joint exercises with Iran in the Strait of Hormuz under the banner of Maritime Security Belt 2026, are watching every development with intense interest and have signaled their displeasure at any American escalation. Russia's Nikolai Patrushev framed those joint exercises as part of a larger strategic confrontation between the United States and the BRICS alliance. China has openly said that countries should stop pushing sanctions and inciting confrontation with Iran. Neither China nor Russia is likely to take direct military action in defense of Iran, and both countries chose not to intervene during the June 2025 strikes. But their presence complicates any American military campaign politically and potentially operationally, and it signals to Tehran that it is not entirely alone in this confrontation. The fundamental question at the center of this crisis, the question that nobody in Washington seems to have a satisfying answer to, is this. If economic collapse does not break Iran's nuclear resolve, and if military strikes do not break it either, then what exactly is the theory of victory? The June 2025 strikes, by the administration's own subsequent admissions through Witkoff's 1 week to a bomb statement, did not eliminate Iran's nuclear capability. They damaged it, delayed it. But Iran responded by rebuilding more cleverly, more deeply, more resiliently. A bigger strike campaign would cause more damage, but Iran would rebuild again. And each round of strikes potentially strengthens the hardliners within the Iranian system, who argue that the only true deterrent against American military aggression is a completed nuclear weapon. There is a school of thought, voiced by analysts at the Arms Control Association, that the most dangerous outcome would be a massive U.S. attack that fails to destroy Iran's leadership, fails to topple the regime, and leaves a battered but defiant Islamic Republic with even greater motivation to accelerate its nuclear weapons program, and with the sympathy of much of the global South. This is the terrible geometry of the current moment. On one side, you have a United States administration that has staked enormous credibility on the promise that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon under any circumstances, backed by the most powerful military force ever assembled in the region, led by a president who has already ordered one strike and is giving every indication he is prepared to order another, larger one. On the other side, you have an Iranian system that has survived 45 years of sanctions, multiple wars, assassinations of its scientists and generals, a crippled economy, and direct military strikes on its nuclear infrastructure, and that continues to say, with remarkable consistency, that it will not abandon enrichment. An Iranian military and intelligence apparatus that is actively preparing for a potential decapitation strike against its own supreme leader and has made structural provisions to ensure continuity of policy regardless. A country whose leadership, at every level, civilian and military, clerical and revolutionary, has institutionalized the nuclear program as a non-negotiable element of national identity and regime survival. And somewhere in between, trapped in this confrontation, are 93 million Iranian people who did not choose this crisis, who cannot afford bread, who cannot get cancer medication, whose currency has become worthless, whose young men between 25 and 40 are almost half unemployed, who rose up in the streets at the end of 2025 and were met with a death toll that may have reached tens of thousands, and who are now facing the prospect of their country becoming a battlefield in a war between two governments, neither of which is speaking for their interests. The sanctions that have been openly celebrated as a tool for destabilizing the regime are, in practice, destroying the lives of civilians, while the regime's security apparatus remains funded, armed, and operational. The IRGC transferred more than $1 billion to Hezbollah in the first 10 months of 2025, while ordinary Iranians could not afford cooking oil. The next 10 to 15 days will tell us a great deal. Either Iran presents a proposal that gives Trump enough to declare victory while preserving some form of enrichment, a formula that some analysts believe may still be theoretically possible, or the talks collapse and the world will be watching to see whether Trump carries through on the deadline. If he does, the consequences will cascade in ways that no model can fully predict. If he does not, the credibility of the ultimatum erodes, and Iran learns once again that American deadlines can be waited out. Neither outcome is clean. Neither outcome resolves the underlying problem. The program that was supposed to be obliterated is still running. The economy that was supposed to force concessions has collapsed without producing them. The military force that was supposed to deter has instead accelerated Iran's drive to put its nuclear infrastructure beyond the reach of any future strike. And the statement that even if Khamenei dies, the program will not stop is not a boast. It is a statement of structural reality. This nuclear program now belongs not to one man, not to one generation of clerics, but to the institutional identity of the Islamic Republic itself and to the military commanders who will define whatever comes after it. That is what changes everything. And that is why this moment is unlike anything that has come before.